Every person alive on Earth today, all 8 billion of us, descended from a single group of survivors so small, they could have fit inside a high school gymnasium. Not a stadium, a gymnasium. That is not a metaphor. That is the scientific reality of what happened 74,000 years ago, and most people have never heard this story. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never look at another human being the same way again. The sky didn't just turn dark. It turned heavy, a bruised purple that eventually collapsed into a suffocating, soot-colored void. Imagine standing on a ridge 74,000 years ago, feeling the ground beneath your feet vibrate with a frequency so low it rattles your teeth before you even hear the sound. When the sound finally arrives, it isn't a bang. It is the roar of the earth literally tearing itself open in Sumatra. This was the Toba Supereruption, a cataclysmic event that didn't just change the weather. It nearly deleted our entire species from the map. We weren't a global empire back then. We were a fragile collection of wandering bands, and suddenly the sun vanished behind a curtain of sulfuric acid and ash. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed the fire. The sheer scale of this disaster is almost impossible for the modern human brain to process without a reference point. Imagine nearly 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock and debris being vaporized and launched into the stratosphere in a matter of days. That is enough material to cover the entire continental United States in a layer of ash several inches thick. Every single state, coast to coast, buried. The smell would have been the first thing to break you, a pungent, acidic stench of rotten eggs that burned the lining of your throat with every breath. Scientists like Stanley Ambrose have spent decades piecing together the psychological and physical toll of this moment. And the data is terrifying. It wasn't just a bad week or a rough year. It was a decade of volcanic winter, where the temperature dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius across the entire planet. 15 degrees. That is the difference between a warm spring afternoon in Tennessee and a frozen wasteland. Then the starvation began. If you were a human living in Africa or the fringes of Asia at this time, your entire world had just turned gray. The plants you gathered were covered in toxic dust, and the animals you hunted were falling dead by the thousands, their lungs clogged with glass-like shards of volcanic silica. You were looking at your family, watching the ribs start to poke through their skin, and you realize the sun hasn't felt warm on your face in 3 years. This is the moment where history nearly ended. This is the genetic bottleneck, a period where the total population of Homo sapiens plummeted to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. We weren't a thriving species anymore. We were an endangered one, hanging onto the edge of a cliff by our fingernails. Here is something that should stop you cold. A chimpanzee troop living in a single square mile of African forest has more genetic diversity than every human being alive on Earth today. Every single person. You, me, everyone. All 8 billion of us carry less variation in our DNA than a few hundred chimps in the Congo. Think about that number for a second and let it land. We know this happened because our own DNA carries the scars of this era like a permanent brand. When geneticists look at the human genome today, they notice a strange, haunting lack of diversity compared to other primates. This is because we all descend from that tiny, desperate group of survivors who didn't give up when the world turned into a frozen wasteland. Every person you see on the street, every president, every child born in an American hospital tonight is a direct descendant of a person who managed to find water and food when there was none. It makes you realize that our survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a statistical miracle. But then I found something buried in the research that changed everything I thought I knew about what makes us human. And I need to tell you about it. The survivors didn't just live because they were strong. They lived because something shifted in the way they thought. And the evidence for this shift is hiding in plain sight, in every museum, every campfire story, and every friendship you've ever had. Before Toba, humans lived in relatively isolated groups. But the pressure of the extinction event forced a psychological shift toward hypersocial behavior. We started trading, sharing information over longer distances, and creating complex symbolic art to find meaning in the chaos. It was a period of intense, repressed fear that manifested as a desperate need for connection. You can almost feel the tension in the archaeological record. The transition from simple tools to sophisticated survival strategies, born of pure necessity. They weren't just fighting the cold. They were fighting the crushing weight of a world that seemed determined to kill them. I wasn't prepared for the realization that our greatest human traits might have been forged in ash. Think about the sensory details of that existence for a moment. You wake up on a bed of dry grass, and the morning air tastes like metal. The light filtering through the cave entrance is a dim, sickly orange, because the upper atmosphere is still choked with aerosols. You can hear the wind howling across a landscape that used to be a lush forest, but is now a skeletal graveyard of gray trees. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a Netflix dramatization. This was the lived reality for hundreds of generations of real human beings. People who had the same fears, the same love for their children, and the same will to survive that you do right now. The constant, gnawing hunger creates a specific kind of internal quiet, a focus on the next step, the next berry, the next heartbeat. Our ancestors weren't thinking about the future, because the present was a suffocating weight. Yet, in that darkness, something in the human spirit refused to flicker out. This era of near-extinction shaped the very way your brain processes fear today. When you feel that sudden spike of anxiety in a dark room, or the instinct to huddle with others during a crisis, that is a 74,000-year-old echo firing in your nervous system. We are the children of the bottleneck, wired for survival in a world that can disappear in a heartbeat. The Journal of Human Evolution points to this period as the possible great leap forward, the moment our cognitive abilities accelerated because the alternative was death. It is a haunting thought that the most beautiful aspects of American culture and human culture broadly, our music, our storytelling tradition, our capacity for deep empathy, might be the byproduct of a global trauma so severe it rearranged our very biology. We didn't just survive the era, we were fundamentally redefined by it. Stick with me, because what comes next is the part that most history books completely skip over. And it changes the entire story of who we are. But there is a darker side to this history that people rarely talk about. As the population dwindled, the competition for the few remaining refugia, patches of land that could still support life, must have been brutal. We like to imagine our ancestors huddled together in peaceful cooperation, singing around fires and sharing resources, like a prehistoric episode of Cheers. But the archaeological evidence suggests something far more uncomfortable, a high-stakes, winner-take-all game of territorial survival. You have to wonder what happened to the groups that didn't make it. Were they simply unlucky? Or were they pushed out by those more willing to do whatever it took to endure? This wasn't a peaceful time of reflection. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for the right to exist. The trauma of those thousands of years of struggle is baked into our history, a silent reminder that nature doesn't care about our plans or our dreams. And here is the part no one talks about. That darkness didn't disappear. It survived too. Scientists estimate that for every 10 people alive at the peak of the bottleneck, 9 of them didn't make it. 9 out of 10. That's the equivalent of wiping out the entire population of the United States and leaving only 35 million people to restart civilization from scratch in a world with no sun. As the ash finally began to settle and the skies cleared centuries later, the humans who emerged were different. They were smarter, more resilient, and deeply interconnected in ways their ancestors had never been. They began to migrate out of Africa with a new sense of purpose, spreading across the globe like a fire that had been suppressed for too long. The Toba catastrophe was the ultimate test, a filter that stripped away everything non-essential and left behind a version of humanity that was built to conquer the planet. It's a strange paradox. The event that almost wiped us out is the very reason we became the dominant species today. We are the leftovers of a disaster, the tough, scarred remains of a much larger family that didn't make it through the dark. If this is landing differently than you expected, that's exactly the point. Keep watching, because the final piece of this story is the one that will actually change how you see yourself. I sat in silence for a long time after reading the final reports on the genetic drift of that era. It makes our modern problems feel incredibly small when you realize how close we came to being nothing more than a weird layer of fossils in the dirt. We aren't the masters of the earth. We are the guests who managed to survive the house burning down. The next time you watch a sunrise over the Manhattan skyline, or feel the warmth hit your face on a summer morning in the Midwest, remember that for our ancestors, that sight was a lost dream for years on end. The era that almost wiped us out didn't just leave us with a smaller gene pool. It left us with a lingering, subconscious knowledge that the world is fragile. We are walking miracles, built from the ashes of a world that tried its best to forget we ever existed. Remember that psychological shift I mentioned? The one hiding in plain sight? Here is the payoff. Every time you reach out to a friend when you're struggling, every time a community rallies after a disaster, every time a stranger helps someone they'll never see again, that is the Toba response still running in your operating system. The hypersocial behavior that saved us from extinction didn't vanish when the skies cleared. It became the core of what we call civilization. Art, religion, language, law, all of it traces back to a terrified group of survivors who chose connection over isolation when the world went dark. The story of the bottleneck isn't just a history lesson. It's a mirror. At the start of this video, I told you that every person alive today descended from a group small enough to fit in a gymnasium. Now you know why, and now you know what it cost. When everything was stripped away, the technology, the certainty, the next meal, what remained was a primal, unshakable will to keep breathing. And to keep breathing together. We don't miss the sun until it's gone for a generation. We don't realize how much we need each other until there are only a few thousand of us left. The darkness of 74,000 years ago still lives in the back of your mind, a quiet voice that reminds you how quickly the lights can go out. We survived the Toba winter, but we emerged into a world where we can never truly feel safe alone. We are the survivors. And every single thing that makes you human, your love, your fear, your need for connection, is the proof.